Have you ever stopped to think about what happened to soldiers who return home from battle seriously wounded? We often hear about soldiers being celebrated as heroes, their bravery praised, and their sacrifices honored. But for many who came back with physical and mental scars, their journey didn't end with the battle. In fact, for these soldiers, the war didn't end when the fighting stopped. The true struggle began once they were home, and that's where their real story started. In today's video, we're going to explore the often overlooked fate of soldiers who were seriously wounded on the battlefield. What happened to them after they survived the initial injuries? What challenges did they face? Were they welcomed home as heroes, or did they face a much darker reality? Stick with us as we dive into the difficult, painful, and often tragic truth about the fate of these soldiers. From the agony of their physical wounds to the deep psychological toll that haunted them for the rest of their lives. The journey of a wounded soldier is one filled with hardship, sacrifice, and resilience. This is a story you don't hear often, but it's a crucial one. Let's uncover the hidden realities of the fate of soldiers who return from battle severely wounded. When we think of soldiers coming home after war, the images that typically come to mind are those of victory parades and celebrations. We imagine a hero returning home, to be embraced by family and friends. But this image is only part of the story. For many soldiers, particularly those who were seriously injured, returning home meant entering a world that had no place for them. The wounds they carried were not just physical, but also emotional and psychological. Their return was not a triumphant march to glory, but a painful struggle to rebuild their lives. Let's take a closer look at the fate of these soldiers and understand what awaited them after the battle ended. The physical struggles. In the past, when a soldier was seriously wounded in battle, there was no guarantee they would survive, let alone recover. Modern medical technology, antibiotics, and surgical advancements didn't exist. Wounds that today would be considered treatable could easily become deadly in earlier times. If a soldier sustained a deep cut, a gunshot wound, or an injury from a sharp object like a sword, they could be left to fight off infection without the help of antibiotics. In some of the most brutal wars, soldiers returned home with injuries so severe that survival itself was a question. In the Civil War, for example, soldiers who suffered gunshot wounds often didn't have access to the kinds of medical treatments we take for granted today. Doctors relied on basic, sometimes painful treatments like amputations, which, while necessary, were far from perfect. Amputation was often a last-ditch effort to save a soldier's life from gangrene or infection, and many soldiers returned home missing limbs scarred and broken. What's even more heartbreaking is the fact that the recovery process was not easy for those soldiers. With the limited medical knowledge of the time, many soldiers who survived their injuries were left with permanent disabilities. A soldier with a leg or arm amputated would face a long and difficult recovery. Prosthetics existed, but they were far from the sophisticated, functional replacements we have today. The first prosthetics were often uncomfortable and poorly designed. Soldiers had to adapt to life with missing limbs, but many found it difficult to integrate back into civilian life with such drastic changes to their bodies. A soldier who lost a leg in battle might have to spend years learning how to walk again, and they might have to rely on the charity of others or government assistance just to survive. For many, this kind of permanent disability meant they could no longer work or provide for their families, leading them into poverty. For those soldiers lucky enough to survive and keep a part of their body intact, the damage to their bones, muscles, and nerves could still be debilitating. The absence of modern pain management techniques made it even harder for these soldiers to bear their injuries. The emotional and psychological struggles. While the physical wounds are often the most visible, the emotional scars of war are just as deep, if not deeper. The psychological toll of battle on soldiers is something that wasn't fully understood for centuries. It wasn't until recent decades that we began to truly grasp the impact of war on mental health, and the term PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, was coined to describe what soldiers had long suffered. In the past, soldiers who returned home after experiencing the horrors of battle often struggled with intense feelings of fear, anger, and guilt. They were haunted by the memories of what they had seen and done, and these emotional wounds were often far worse than the physical ones. In earlier times, these mental health struggles were either ignored or misunderstood. Many soldiers were labeled as weak or crazy if they showed signs of what we now recognize as PTSD. It wasn't unusual for a soldier to return home mentally shattered, only to be ignored by society or treated as an outsider. Mental health services were essentially non-existent for soldiers who came back from battle, and in many cases, these veterans were left to cope with their trauma alone. Those who suffered from shell shock, a term used to describe PTSD during World War I, found little understanding or support. They may have been ostracized from their communities, their struggles dismissed, and their pain silenced. For those who had survived physical wounds but were left mentally scarred, reintegration into society was a monumental challenge. Family members, while often supportive, could do little to help. A soldier who came home with the mental and emotional scars of war found it difficult to communicate their pain to others. They may have been treated with sympathy, but sympathy wasn't enough to heal deep psychological wounds. Many soldiers who returned home wounded found themselves struggling to adapt to a world that didn't understand their experiences, leading to a sense of isolation. The role of family in society. The fate of a wounded soldier was also closely tied to their family's ability to care for them and society's willingness to help. In earlier times, families often had to take on the responsibility of caring for a wounded soldier, and for many, this meant sacrificing their own well-being. Wounded soldiers, especially those with permanent disabilities, required constant care, which placed a heavy burden on their families. While some families were able to provide the care and support needed, many were struggling just to make ends meet, leaving soldiers in a difficult position. The societal view of these wounded veterans was mixed. Some soldiers were viewed as heroes deserving of respect and care. Others, especially those with visible scars or disabilities, were seen as pitiful reminders of war's brutal reality. The stigma surrounding disabled veterans meant that they were often marginalized or forgotten. Unlike today, when veterans are often honored and supported through various programs, soldiers returning from war in past centuries received little in the way of formal recognition or care. In times when social welfare systems didn't exist, soldiers who returned home with disabilities often found themselves living in poverty. They couldn't work, and if they had lost their ability to provide for their families, the burden fell on the shoulders of their spouses or children. In some cases, soldiers who were unable to care for themselves or contribute to society were sent to veterans' homes or asylums, where they lived out the remainder of their lives in isolation. Many of these institutions were poorly funded, and the conditions were often harsh. This was especially true for soldiers who suffer from both physical and mental wounds. For those soldiers who didn't have the support of family or society, their fate was even bleaker. Many were left to fend for themselves, unable to secure employment or social standing. The lack of understanding about mental health, the limited medical options, and the social stigma surrounding disabled veterans made life after war incredibly difficult for many soldiers. The long-term consequences. The impact of war on a soldier's life didn't end when they left the battlefield. Soldiers who returned home seriously wounded often spent the rest of their lives grappling with the consequences of their injuries, both physical and psychological. For some, the effect of their injuries were permanent. Those who lost limbs or suffered long-term health problems were often forced to adapt to a new way of life. Those with psychological scars had to live with the haunting memories of war. The long-term consequences for these soldiers were compounded by the lack of modern rehabilitation programs or support systems. In many cases, they had to navigate their recovery alone, without the help of government programs, medical professionals, or support networks. Many soldiers were left to live in poverty, isolated from the society they fought to protect. Their stories often went untold, their sacrifices forgotten. The forgotten soldiers. Throughout history, soldiers who returned home severely wounded were often forgotten. Their struggles, their pain, and their sacrifices were overlooked, overshadowed by the glory of war and victory. For many soldiers, the battles they fought on the battlefield were only the beginning. The real struggle came after the fighting ended, when they had to fight to survive in a society that didn't understand or care about the challenges they faced. The psychological struggles, a deeper look. It's easy to think that a soldier's worst battle is the one fought on the battlefield, but for many soldiers who return home seriously wounded, their greatest battle occurred within their own minds. A soldier returning home after surviving the horrors of war, especially after facing severe physical injury, often had to deal with what we now understand as PTSD. In earlier times, however, there was little understanding of mental health, and emotional scars of war were treated as signs of weakness or simply ignored altogether. War, in its most brutal form, changes people. Witnessing death, hearing the cries of fellow soldiers, and being in constant fear of your life can leave an indelible mark on the psyche. This trauma doesn't always manifest immediately. Often, it takes years for symptoms of PTSD to fully emerge. Soldiers who had witnessed the unthinkable may have returned home appearing physically healed, only to face nightmares, panic attacks, and intense feelings of guilt and fear. One of the greatest tragedies of these soldiers was that their suffering often went unnoticed. The mental health field had not yet developed a vocabulary or understanding to address such wounds. Soldiers were told to man up or get over it. Many of them found themselves trapped in an emotional prison, unable to communicate the depth of their pain. Imagine being a soldier who returned with visible wounds, like the loss of a limb, but also silently carrying the weight of psychological scars that no one could see. The emotional wounds were often harder to heal than the physical ones. The guilt associated with surviving a brutal battle, especially if comrades did not return, could weigh heavily on a soldier. This feeling of survivor's guilt, coupled with flashbacks, anxiety, and depression, left many soldiers reeling. However, society's inability to recognize or address these struggles meant that many of these soldiers were left to fight their mental battles alone, often in silence. The struggles of reintegration into society. As wounded soldiers return home, they face the often difficult task of reintegrating into society. A major challenge for them was the physical disabilities they had to cope with. Many soldiers were unable to return to their previous jobs, particularly if they had lost limbs or faced significant disfigurements. A soldier who had once worked as a carpenter or blacksmith could no longer perform such tasks. This loss of income meant they had to find new ways to provide for themselves and their families, but the opportunities were limited. Often, wounded soldiers were forced into low-paying or degrading jobs, which further eroded their sense of dignity. In addition to their struggle to make a living, these soldiers faced a challenge of reconciling their new identity. They had been warriors, and returning home to a civilian life after having experienced the brutal realities of battle was an incredibly difficult transition. How could a soldier who had fought for his country ever truly go back to a life of normalcy? How could he reconcile the image of himself as a fighter, a protector, with the man now dependent on the help of others? The harsh reality of being physically and mentally wounded was that it could alienate soldiers from their families, friends, and communities. Those who returned home with visible scars, whether a missing limb, a disfigured face, or other injuries, often became social outcasts. Their families and friends may have wanted to help, but they could feel awkward or helpless in the face of such drastic changes. Society, on the whole, didn't have the mechanisms in place to support these soldiers in the way that we might expect today. Many wounded veterans felt like burdens, and the lack of employment opportunities only amplified this feeling. The stigma attached to their injuries didn't just come from strangers. In some cases, even those closest to the soldier, family members, former comrades, and even wives, could not fully understand the psychological toll of war. When soldiers came home with trauma that wasn't visible, there was little empathy or understanding. Instead of receiving the care and support they needed, many soldiers were simply told to move on with their lives. But for these soldiers, moving on wasn't so simple. The scars of war were far too deep, and the wounds far too painful for that. Social support systems, or lack thereof. One of the most significant issues faced by returning wounded soldiers was a lack of a structured support system. In many cases, soldiers who returned from battle with severe injuries had no access to rehabilitation, mental health care, or financial assistance. The concept of veterans care, as we know it today, didn't exist in the past. In earlier times, the government provided very little support for wounded veterans, and soldiers were often left to fend for themselves. This left soldiers to rely on their families or charitable organizations for support. The families, as we have already discussed, were often ill-equipped to provide the level of care that these soldiers needed. Many families had their own struggles to contend with, making it difficult for them to fully care for a wounded loved one. Furthermore, Charitable organizations that might have stepped in were limited, and their resources were stretched thin, especially during and after wars that left large numbers of soldiers needing care. In many ways, this lack of support exacerbated the problems of wounded soldiers. Without financial assistance, many veterans were forced into extreme poverty. Those who were able to work might not have had the same abilities as before, and they faced the stigma of being damaged goods. Even in times of peace, these soldiers had difficulty finding their place in society, as their disabilities often meant they couldn't work in the fields or other labor-intensive jobs. This further deepened their sense of isolation. Some veterans were lucky enough to be supported by local communities. In some parts of the world, when a soldier returned, the town or village would hold a small ceremony of recognition, providing financial or emotional support. But these instances were rare. For the most part, wounded soldiers face a lonely road with little recognition or care. It is this lack of recognition that has led to the tragic neglect of so many veterans throughout history. The impact on families. The toll on the families of wounded soldiers was enormous. The emotional, physical, and financial burden often fell squarely on the shoulders of the family members. For wives, mothers, and children, having a loved one return from war seriously wounded meant more than just caring for the injured soldier. It also meant adjusting to a new family dynamic, where the soldier's role in the household had changed. In many cases, wives had to become the primary caregivers for their husbands. These women not only had to deal with the physical demands of taking care of an injured spouse, but also had to manage the emotional and psychological burdens that came with living with someone who had experienced the horrors of war. For many families, especially in the days before modern health care, this care was unrelenting. For children, having a parent return from war with a permanent injury could be a difficult adjustment. Children often saw their fathers as larger-than-life figures, heroes who protected them. But after returning from battle, these fathers were often vulnerable, unable to live up to the idealized version of the strong protector. The families of wounded soldiers also faced significant financial stress. Wounded soldiers who were unable to work had to rely on their families to make ends meet. In many cases, families were pushed into poverty. As a result, children often had to step in and help support the family, taking on work that was too much for them, as the soldier, now wounded and struggling, could not. In these cases, the soldier's injury didn't just affect them. It affected the entire family, creating a ripple effect that could last for generations. The psychological strain of seeing a loved one suffer often led to strained family relationships. Wives, children, and extended family members became caregivers, emotionally and physically drained by the constant demands of caring for a wounded soldier. This created a complicated and often difficult family dynamic, where love and duty collided with the harsh realities of life with a war-weary veteran. The story of a soldier who returns home seriously wounded is not just one of survival. It's a tale of struggle, sacrifice, and resilience that stretches far beyond the battlefield. While the media often portrays soldiers as heroes, celebrated for their courage in war, the reality for many of them is far more complex. The true challenge begins when they leave the battlefield, but the battle they face at home is one that is rarely acknowledged. For soldiers who return with severe physical or mental injuries, the road ahead is filled with hardships, many of which they must face alone. The physical wounds are the most obvious and visible, but the emotional and psychological scars run far deeper. Soldiers who return home with disfigurements, amputations, or debilitating injuries often have to adjust to a completely new way of life, one that doesn't look or feel like the life they once knew. The loss of a limb or the permanent damage to a body part means they can no longer engage in the same activities or work in the same ways. Their identity, too, changes. A soldier who was once strong, capable, and independent may now find themselves dependent on others for even the most basic tasks. This loss can be overwhelming, leading to feelings of helplessness and hopelessness. But perhaps even more devastating than the physical injuries are the invisible wounds, those emotional scars that can last a lifetime, where it does not just break the body, it breaks the mind. The trauma soldiers experience on the battlefield, witnessing death, fear, and loss, leaves a deep imprint on their psyche. PTSD, depression, anxiety are common, yet often overlooked or misunderstood. Society may not recognize these mental struggles, and the soldiers who suffer from them are left to battle in silence. This lack of understanding coupled with the stigma of mental illness, only makes their reintegration into civilian life that much harder. The psychological pain of war, combined with physical limitations, creates a sense of alienation for many wounded soldiers. They no longer feel like they belong in the communities they return to, and they often feel like outsiders in their own homes. Family members may struggle to understand what their loved ones have been through, and friends may feel uncomfortable or unsure how to help. The result is a deep sense of isolation, where soldiers may feel forgotten, overlooked, or worse, like a burden. It's easy to forget that these soldiers, whom we may view as war heroes, are human beings who carry the weight of their experiences long after the war ends. The fate of these men and women is not just about the injuries they sustain, but about how society chooses to treat them once the battle is over. Too often, the heroism of their service is overshadowed by the hardship of their recovery. We owe these soldiers so much more than just a simple thank you. They deserve our empathy, our support, and our recognition for the long road they travel after they return home. Their struggles with mental health, their difficulty reintegrating into society, and their fight for basic needs should not be overlooked. We must do better for those who have sacrificed so much. We must ensure they receive the care, respect, and opportunity to live fulfilling lives after the war is over. In the end, the fate of a soldier who returns from battle seriously wounded is a testament to their resilience, but also highlights the deep gaps in how we as a society care for our veterans. It's a reminder that, as much as we honor their bravery during war, we must also commit to supporting them long after the war ends. These soldiers, who endured unimaginable pain and suffering, are deserving of much more than recognition. They are deserving of care, dignity, and the chance to live meaningful lives once they return home.